As a professional negotiator who not only actually negotiates, but also teaches courses on how to conduct big, complicated negotiations, I do get asked for my opinions on Brexit and how those negotiations went. Now, I don't really like to speak about this sort of topic because it is extremely emotive and raw for many people. But there are an awful lot of lessons we can learn from Brexit in terms of how and how not to conduct negotiations of this nature. So I'm going to talk about that in this session. But there's a couple of things I'm going to stress first. One, this is purely about negotiation, all the strategies, the techniques and use. This is not a political discussion. This is not going to be discussing about Brexit itself, whether it was a good idea or not. I'll leave that to other political commentators. The second thing I'm also going to stress up front as a disclaimer is that I myself was not intimately involved with Brexit or the negotiations. I am an international negotiator. I do even have experience as a trade negotiator. I've negotiated trade agreements myself. However, I wasn't involved in Brexit. So I want to stress that all these commentary and observations are my own observations and things I've learnt from speaking to people that were involved, but I myself do not have true insider knowledge of what happened in Brexit, although I do have a very good idea of what did happen. So let's start. Whenever I talk about any negotiation, I will talk about preparation. How was that negotiation prepared for? And of course, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Brexit in this regards. It's hard to be positive about it because, quite frankly, it was awful. And there is Theresa May's famous quote, "Brexit means Brexit." Unfortunately, catchy as that soundbite might be, it actually just reveals a fundamental inability to communicate what Brexit is. And this we can see throughout the entirety of the process. So if you cannot communicate what Brexit is, you just have a catchy slogan, you're going to struggle to get very far. So here's your first clue to things going wrong. You've got sound bites, we haven't got clear communication. But I'm going to drill down into this preparation theme a bit further. So let's talk about doing the basics. For any negotiation of this type, you simply cannot fail to do the basics. You must do these things if you wish to get anywhere in any kind of complicated and big negotiation. So the first thing that I alluded to with that commentary on Brexit means Brexit is you've got to set out clear objectives. You've got to understand what it is you're seeking to achieve. And yes, we'll have to recognise that Brexit was a very political topic. It didn't have clearer goals, for example, economic or any other type of thing that's a little bit more tangible. It was an intangible goal. But nonetheless, even within that sort of limitation, you still have to really understand what it is you want to secure as part of this negotiation. I suppose a question worth asking is, how do we make things better for us? How do we get ourselves a better position, a better deal, a better outcome? And that question was never really asked in any meaningful, proper way. So as a consequence of that, there was never really any clear objectives. Were we going to be in the single market? Were we going to be outside the single market? What was our relationship with the EU going to be like? How were we going to handle the contracts, our commitments to the EU, and so on and so forth? None of that was set out in any meaningful way. So the second point I'd make is understanding the negotiation. And what I mean by that is that not all negotiations are the same. So negotiating for a used car or negotiating for something in a marketplace is not the same as negotiating at the highest level, at international level, at government level. In fact, even business-to-business negotiation is not the same as government or government organisation negotiation. There's some fundamental rules, principles that you have to follow. You have to understand how that game is played if you want to do well at it. And I think it was pretty clear right from the beginning that the UK Brexit negotiator did not do that. There was far too much talk of haggling, if you like, bargaining positions. That is not how you operate at the top tiers of government. It doesn't work that way. So that sort of language, that political rhetoric that happened at the time, very much revealed that the main players didn't actually know how to conduct a negotiation, what kind of negotiation they were doing. They were very much approaching this as an adversarial style negotiation with the EU. And I've talked about adversarial versus collaborative. And whilst it's obviously clear that there are going to be adversarial elements, unfortunately, the approach cannot be adversarial. I always say that for big negotiations, your approach has to be collaborative. Yes, you may not be in aligned positions. You may be arguing against what it is the other side are proposing. But to do that, you use an approach that is thorough and meticulous. And right from the beginning, that was clear this was not done. The third point is understanding the details, which feeds into a little bit of the second point. These style of negotiation, they're not one on rhetoric. They're not one on having good arguments or anything like that. Those are almost irrelevant. You win, if you can call it that, these sort of negotiations by understanding every single little detail of everything. Whatever it is you want to negotiate, you've got to be an expert or have experts in the room. You've got to have your objective. You've got to know what works, what does not work. In short, you've just got to be very well prepared. And you're very well prepared by knowing your subject matter inside and out. And this was always going to be a problem for the UK. The UK hadn't had experience of proper international trade negotiation for a long time. That was all done by the EU. But nonetheless, there was a clear failure to get into the details of the UK's proposals. And it was very widely and publicly reported that the EU was expressing frustration at the incoherence of the UK's position, the contradictory things that the UK was asking for. And that was clearly because they hadn't dug into the detail. They hadn't understood all the trade-off, all the parameters of what they wanted to ask for, to propose to the EU. And you don't really get that sort of commentary come from the other side in a public way. And speaking from personal experience, when doing that sort of business, you actually don't want the other side to come at you having not done their preparation, their homework properly. It's just frustrating. It's just a terrible experience to have to try and correct all their mistakes. It makes the negotiations so much harder. You just achieve less. And the EU wanted to achieve things at these negotiations. And there was no doubt they felt that the UK was so badly prepared that it did not necessarily get the sense that the UK wanted to achieve anything in the negotiation. In fact, I think there was even potential belief from the EU's negotiation side that the UK were going through the motions and that actually this would all change and they'd pull out and cancel Brexit or whatever. And that, no doubt, that was obviously fed by political wills and whims and so on, but no doubt a big driver behind that was them seeing that the UK was not into the details and didn't understand it. So moving on to the next point, it's communicating a clear vision. Now Brexit was unique in that it was very much a negotiation conducted in the public eye, and that's made this point even more important. You don't succeed at a negotiation by hiding your negotiation, really. You have to have a belief in what you're doing. And I talk about that, it sounds a bit weird to people, but if you don't believe in the arguments you're making, in the position that you're putting forward, no matter how good an actor you might be, you've got to have conviction in your arguments. And it's very hard to subconsciously project that conviction if you don't have that true belief, that clear vision, and that what you're arguing for makes sense, is good, is right for your side. So I think very much that the UK negotiators struggled to communicate that vision both internally and externally, and that made them not credible as negotiators. Even if they said the right things at the meeting, body language, perhaps other subtle cues, would have told a different story. And then the final point on this section I want to mention is buy-in and obtaining consensus. And this is a huge deal in any big negotiation, and something that many people fail to do. At the end of the day, whatever it is you're negotiating, someone else has to agree it, sign off on it. So you have to put a lot of effort into stakeholder management. Now, remembering the events of that time, it was also very clear that Theresa May and her cabinet and negotiators were very determined not to do this. They didn't want to obtain buy-in or approval from the Conservative Party, or the Scottish government, or Welsh government, or even the wider public at large. They didn't do that. They felt that would undermine their position to do so. In contrast, the EU negotiator, Barnier, put a huge amount of effort into it, and that was really obvious. Every single negotiation session he had with the UK, he would stand up in front of the EU Parliament or the Commission, and he would outline all the progress they had made, all the things they had discussed, the compromises he felt that they needed to reach, and he would ask the EU to approve his position. Really clear, really obvious, very smart, very hard to do as well. But he did it in complete contrast to the UK. And I'll come back on to that point a little bit more later. There were also some other major tactical errors made by the UK during these negotiations. I'm going to pick on a few of them. I can't talk about all of them. But one that always stands out in my mind was the issue of settled status. If you remember that at the time, the UK government wanted to treat the issue of settled status as tradable, as something they could bargain with the EU. And that was just fundamentally flawed as a concept, as a tactic. It was just a dreadful thing to do. The reason why I say that is because it wasn't tradable. You can't trade that sort of issue. And the reason why you can't do that is because we're talking matters of principle. And the principle here is the treatment of people. So if you're going to ask or to discuss or negotiate with someone how you would treat a category of people, you cannot make it a scalable commodity. And what I mean by that is you can't treat people more good or less bad as a negotiation tactic. It just doesn't happen. You either treat them right or you don't treat them right. It's almost a binary thing in a sense when it comes to applying principle. So really, the UK government went at this completely wrong. And what they needed to have done from a tactical perspective is take the moral high ground. And you do that by setting out a very clear and agreeable principle. So, for example, the UK government could have said on the matter of the settled status for EU citizens that regardless of what the EU Commission would agree, the UK government would guarantee that all EU citizens within the UK, within Great Britain, would be treated fairly, would have the right to stay there. Not a particularly detailed statement, but it's setting out a very clear principle that people can look at and agree with, essentially. And if they had done that, the EU would have had to rise to that principle. They couldn't have tried to haggle it down, really, not least because the EU likes to pride itself on being a very sort of principled type of organisation that fights for the rights of citizens. So with a very clear statement of principle like that, the UK could have put itself on the front foot on that issue. And the reality is there wasn't really much to negotiate on that specific issue. The UK waited months trying to pretend that this was negotiable, when really it wasn't. It was just a matter of stating the principle and negotiating how you would implement that principle. That's all it was. So for me, that's always stood out as a very clear failure on the UK's part. Another failure was Theresa May's famous red lines. And I call them fake red lines because it was extremely clear fairly early on that these were very arbitrary red lines. These were red lines that the UK were trying to push forward in order to not have to negotiate, when really they weren't red lines. They were stated or strong positions. So what I mean by a red line in this sense is that you would put forward a red line of something you absolutely cannot go under or past. And mainly, this is due to factors outside of your control. So for example, you might go to a negotiation and say, my red line is I cannot spend more than X. And that is because your budget has been set by someone else and they won't give you more money. So that's your red line in that sense. Another red line might be the law says that this minimum standard must be met. I cannot go below that minimum standard. That's a standard set by national law. You don't have any option to deviate from that. You can go above it, you cannot go below it. So that's what a true red line is. And a very common tactical error people make is to put forward a position and to state it is simply a red line. And then for the other side to see through that, call the bluff, as it were, and then start to negotiate around the edges of that red line. And before you know it, they pretty much compromise the red line. And when that happens, you've essentially lost your credibility. So when Theresa May set out those fatal red lines that were easily countered by the EU, they were able to argue that the red lines were completely inconsistent with each other and with other stated goals in the negotiation. From that point onwards, those negotiations lost credibility. So I talk about purpose or belief. I mentioned about that earlier. And this comes down to the whole, what does Brexit mean in terms of the relationship? What was the UK going to do? Was it going to be the Norway model, for example? That was talked about a lot, but there was never any clear sense that the UK wanted anything coherent. What the UK wanted was something that was essentially felt unachievable, and certainly that is no secret at all that many people analysed the UK position, not least the EU and not least outside observers, felt that the UK position was completely incoherent. Either you're in the single market or you weren't. Either you adhere to the rules or you didn't, or you negotiated certain exceptions or exemptions or whatever. But none of that was clear. It never felt like the UK knew what they wanted to achieve, what the future relationship looked like. And that very much reflected the political reality. And which is the complete lack of unity. On the UK side, the Conservative Party alone was completely not in unity. Parliament was not in unity. The regions of Great Britain were not at all in unity with what was being negotiated for Brexit. And that very much fatally undermines your position, because when you do go to negotiations, you have to project unity. Everybody has to be on the same page. And if you do have arguments, and in the preparation stage of preparing for negotiations, you will have internal arguments or disagreements. You always have to get those out behind closed doors, resolve the differences, reach agreement, and then when you go to the negotiation table, everybody sings from the same hymn sheet. Everybody knows the plan, they're in complete agreement. And the UK never had that. And even if the UK negotiators tried to do that, the political noise was such that it was exceedingly obvious to everybody outside and on the other side that they did not have that unity. And that was fatal for being able to secure proposals, secure compromises. I would also talk about managing complexity a lot in these negotiations, and that is a big part of negotiations of this scale, and what Brexit is about as big and as complicated as they come. And I can speak from experience on this. It's hugely daunting to look at any tasks like that. But there's so many different tools for managing complexity. You break it down into manageable chunks. You approach it systematically. There's a whole raft of different techniques that professional people can use to handle complexity in any kind of business or project, infrastructure, or any other such situation. They have tools, method by which they will manage that complexity. And it never felt like the Department of International Trade was able to do that. They were a new department, and they did not recruit the right people. That was clear. The people didn't know how to conduct a negotiation, didn't know how to prepare for one, how to handle the very big, complicated issues, and also how to set clear position for the politician to follow. So that flowed upwards, that lack of complexity, lack of depth. And so you could always get the feeling that UK negotiators could only ever speak in very superficial, very shallow terms. They couldn't speak with conviction in depth on any specific issue. And there was always holes in the argument, as it were. And that comes down to simply not digging into the details and getting to understand the issue at hand and to resolve all the problems. The final point I'll also make, which is a dreadful tactic. I don't know why anyone ever even thought this was sensible. The UK actually relied on the EU negotiation team to not have unity, to not have a clear position. For the EU to descend into 26 warring states, I suppose, which is a very stupid thing to do. You never go into a negotiation hoping that the other side will be less competent than you. They will be less prepared. You expect the other side just to be worse than you and for that to be a winning strategy. And you really need to reevaluate what it is you think you're doing. Especially if you're going up against an organisation like the EU, which does negotiations on a very regular basis. That's what they do. They're experts at it. So for the UK to expect the EU negotiations not to be competent was an extraordinarily odd position. And in fact, I did hear some horror stories that the UK negotiation, I hope this is not true, but unfortunately probably was, that they actually took with them barristers, behavioural psychologists and all that sort of stuff to the negotiation. They went mob-handed. And that itself is another big failure. You never take anyone to a negotiation that doesn't have a specific purpose there. You don't bring people whose sole job it is to scrutinise you. That shows weakness. There's a common urban myth, well, probably not an urban myth, but there's the common story that the Chinese, for example, like to turn up to the UN mob-handed because they think the numbers give them power. The actual truth is the reverse that's true. If the other side turns up with a whole bunch of people who all they do is sit there and nod to whatever the lead negotiators are saying, that does not project strength or confidence. It projects weakness. Or that you're on an ego power trip and trying to look good. Either way, one person making a really good argument is far more effective than having 10 people try to make the same argument. That's the honest truth. So you just need a small number of very capable people fully prepared, fully versed in their subject matter to make strong, coherent arguments. And that will win the day far more effectively than turning up in numbers. So talking about people, I hope this is not too controversial a statement, but I think the leadership for Brexit was truly awful. And I don't like to descend into any kind of personality criticism. However, there are going to be a couple of personalities I will draw out here for the purpose of negotiation strategy analysis. Let's talk about David Davis. The best way I can put this is that if you're ever going to go into negotiation, never ever listen to anything that David Davis said. Every single strategy that he would justify, whether in Parliament or question time or anything like that, was just wrong. Just completely wrong. He treated this as an adversarial negotiation like he was in a Turkish bazaar negotiating a rug. Or a used car salesman, for example. Totally not how you negotiate at this level. He was way out of his depth, clearly obvious in the way that he articulated himself, in the way that he explained how he, the Brexit secretary, were going to get it done. And this picture pretty much sums it all up. And here he is, looking like a complete muppet, being suckered into posing for a picture when it's visually obvious that he looks unprepared. He looks naive. Whether he had all the paperwork sitting in the briefcase behind him, who knows? But certainly he was naive to not notice that the other side had all the paperwork on the table and he and his side did not. So this is not a good image. This shows a very casual, condescending even, attitude to negotiation. And no one can ever turn up to a negotiation knowing everything, without having notes. And let's be honest, even if you are that person, if you do have a photographic memory and you're fully on top, you really can remember everything to exceptional detail, then have papers there anyway, even if it is for show. Have your laptop there for note-taking, whatever it is, because it is a visual mark that you're taking things seriously. It's a demonstration of respect to the other side, that you are taking them seriously, that you are taking notes. By looking like this, you do not look like you're taking the negotiation seriously, even if the reality is different. It's a very poor image. It's a very poor way to project yourself at a negotiation. So I wanted to draw this out here. Another thing I also wanted to draw out was, of course, that Boris Johnson himself then, I suppose, took the lead is probably too generous a term, but did try to made it a very central pillar of his political credibility that he would get Brexit done. And this was problematic in a very significant way. You see, what Johnson did was he put a very arbitrary deadline on negotiations. And he did it very publicly. I mean, it was an impossible deadline. There was no way you can negotiate a trade agreement in a year. Anyone with any common sense whatsoever already knows that. But what it did do was it disempowered the UK negotiation team. Totally disempowered them. Because think about it. If you're going to go and negotiate with a supplier, and that supplier is trying to drive the price up, shall we say, and they know that you need that supply, that you can't do without it. One of the few tradables you've got is time. And you can time them out on the basis that maybe you've got another supplier you can talk to. But if they know you have no time, then they'll run the clock. It's as simple as that. They won't have to concede, because what Johnson did was he put the UK negotiation team under intense pressure to basically take shortcuts, and that is what they did. They had to take massive shortcuts simply to meet the deadline that he set. And the EU negotiators would have known they were forced into taking those shortcuts. And what they would have done It pushed hard, played hardball for a bit, and then appeared to compromise, to conciliate, to help the UK team. But they would have done so in a way very much to their benefit, knowing that the UK team would then have to move on to the next topic too quickly to be able to fully understand what it is they had agreed to, what was the apparent compromise. So really what Johnson did by pushing things so far, by pushing the arbitrary deadlines, was he guaranteed that whatever would be agreed would be very superficial, very shallow, wouldn't be thorough. So I talk about, I'll end this on a few points. There was a clear failure to proofread what was actually agreed, and that's coming out now. I predicted that a long time ago, because one of the key things that I teach people about negotiation is that negotiation is not about sitting around the table and reaching an agreement, not at this level. A negotiation is a multi-stage process of due diligence. You learn things, you put forward proposals, you hear the argument made by the other side, you take all that away and you scrutinize it, just like any lawyer would with a contract or contractual amendment. Exactly the same theme. And that takes time. When you're in a massive rush, you skip, you rush it. And that was clearly obvious in the Trading Cooperation Agreement. There's a whole host of errors, I mean even silly minor errors, but there's no such thing as a minor error in agreements at this level. Every single word has to be correct. Every comma and full stop has to be correct. That is what you do for a public-facing document like that. And it was clear that that was not done. It was clear that there were many mistakes within the document. And if there's so many mistakes in the document, you know there are going to be lots of mistakes in the negotiation as well. The wrong people were involved, they had the wrong skills, and they had the wrong attitude. David Davis and Johnson, they weren't the only ones, but I just hold them up as clear examples of the wrong attitude for conducting negotiations. And it's very hard when you're going up against the best in the business, which the EU are. They can compete with the US, who are also the best in the business. You have to bring the A team. You can't bring the wrong people. And the whole process was flawed from start to finish. It was badly prepared, badly organised, badly thought through. No stakeholder management worth naming. No unity, no anything positive. I'm afraid there's very little to absolutely nothing positive anyone can say about the negotiations. So really what this means in terms of the legacy of Brexit is that it has already become a case study for all international negotiators when they're teaching courses, and they all use Brexit as the example of how not to do it, which is a rather terrible legacy to leave future generations, but there it is. So I hope you found that useful. I'm afraid that's not the most cheerful analysis of this, but on a positive, there are a lot of lessons we can take, a lot of examples of what not to do, how not to conduct negotiations of this type, and you can clearly see all the reasons why in terms of all the subsequent failures that have resulted. And I suppose it's one of the things worth stressing is that if you fail to identify and defend your red line during negotiations, it will usually come and get you. Maybe not necessarily at the negotiations itself, but certainly after you've concluded your agreement, all those failures will come out. It will be obvious. And that is, we're at that point where some of that is now visible with Brexit, not all of it. No doubt there'll be more, but it is very clear that this is going to be a very visible case study for students for many years to come.